In this video, I'm going to explain how all house systems are valid, but for the kind of astrology I practice, and that a lot of you tuning in probably also practice, I find whole sign houses the most valid and most applicable. Pretty straightforward. The structure of this video is pretty much designed like one of the structures of my philosophy papers, so sit down, enjoy the argument, and let's get into the intro. If you're excited to dive into why you should probably be using whole sign houses, do whatever you want, I don't really care. Click the notification bell so you don't miss what the stars have in store for you. If you are new here, this video is brought to you by my very own Modern Magic membership community. It's a community of very, very quickly growing number of us who are astrology enthusiasts, passionate about getting early access to astrology content, exclusive downloads, and like media and things that you can use in your day-to-day life with astrology, private Discord, Facebook group, all the things. So if you're interested in joining us for as low as $7.77 a month, info is down below. Hi, I'm Maren. I am a professional astrologer, author, and entrepreneur. I combine ancient Hellenistic astrology techniques with modern psychological counseling dynamics to provide some grounded guidance. So most of my translation for this comes from a ton of the efforts from Project Hindsight in the 90s, current pioneers of Chris Brennan, Demetra George, Patrick Watson's work, and my own direct reading of these texts over the years and rereading them and understanding more as time goes on. So I will link some of the texts and resources I have down below. If I forget to, just comment. Sometimes I forget. And first off, if you are an astrologer and you have arguments in favor of other house systems that you like understand the history as well, I'd be interested in hearing them. Let's take astrology seriously enough to have philosopher debates and battles. And I don't know, maybe I glorify like the hate mail that philosophers used to mail one another in the 1800s arguing about like causation and whatnot, but maybe that gets me into trouble in the community for being aggressive, so yeah, maybe don't do that. I won't get into counter arguments here for sake of time, but feel free to discuss in the comments. First, we have to define what houses are and what the concept is. The houses are a 12-fold division of the zodiac into distinct sectors. In the 5th century CE, Mesopotamian astrology is around the first record that we have of this 12-fold division, like 12 sectors of a sky, each corresponding to a zodiac sign based on the correlations of movement in that sector of the sky. They watch the movement of planets through these sectors, and Egyptians were focused on the rising and setting of fixed stars, particularly how they applied to the Nile and like the flooding and the riverbanks and the farming implications. So that led them to divide the sky into 36 sections, leading to the decans that we have today. Basically this 36-fold division of the sky based on the locations of fixed stars. This is what actually turned into the basis for what we call the houses. Ancient called the places, now it's the houses. And around 1000 BCE, this knowledge was transmitted from Mesopotamia to Egypt, where signs and houses begin melding. And the idea of the 12 houses seems to have come about because of the idea of the 12 signs, so that the 36 groupings were like, let's make it into 3, so that's 12-12. Hellenistic astrology is therefore the period of the 1st century BCE to the 7th century CE. This is when Alexander's the Great Empire flourished, and therefore astrological knowledge also bloomed. The interconnection of various cultures led to so much synthesis of various ideas from Indian, Greek astrology, all the things really came about and synthesized during this time. Hellenistic astrology is where horoscopic astrology came about, which uses the horoscopos, or the hour marker, or the ascendant to begin the chart and base the astrology off of. This is the first tradition to have clearly defined the starting point of a chart as the ascendant point. The ascendant is the degree of the sign rising over the eastern horizon at a given moment, and then they divided up the entire chart by the ascendant-descendant axis and the midheaven IC axis, so AC-DC, MC-IC, that was like the 4 quadrants of the chart. And Hellenistic astrology really blended like Babylonian omens, Egyptian fixed star work, and then Greek philosophy and myth. This is where 7 planets, 12 signs, 12 houses kind of boom, really flourish, and that's the basis for Western astrology today. And if you go back and look at these ancient authors and text sources, it is volumes very clear that whole sign houses was the original form of house division. I've heard some counter arguments against this and like they're not convincing, which doesn't even really like matter because it's not as if being the original means that it's the best. Appealing to tradition means nothing. This is not my point for why it's the most valid. So flat out, being the oldest and the original means nothing in value. Appealing to tradition is a fallacy, appealing to the future is a fallacy. There is no benefit or detriment for it being older or newer, flat out. However, the fact that it is the original makes it vital to understand because it means that every other house system originated followed from that basis. And it means that the origins of whole sign houses are buried into every other house system, so we have to understand whole sign houses to be able to argue for or against using that or any quadrant house system. And in like hundreds of examples in all these texts. It's like all whole sign houses up to a given point, which we'll get into. So what are whole sign houses? Let's explain that, shall we? The ascendant sign is the whole first house. So the sign rising, the rising sign, the hour marker, blah, 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 regardless of the degree of the hour marker or the ascendant, determines the whole sign first house. So whether the ascendant is 0 degrees or 29 degrees, that is the whole first house, and the rest of the houses fall accordingly subsequently. Each sign corresponds with a whole house, so whole sign houses. So in this example, the ascendant is at 15 degrees of Cancer, and regardless of where that degree would be, Cancer would be the first whole sign house. Every other house following is then correspondent. And to keep things short, because I don't want this to be a rundown of like why houses mean what they do, but house meanings are derived from their whole sign aspect to the ascendant in large part. So for example, first house being the rising sign is where the body rises, where you came to life, your vibrancy, your personality, character, vitality. Seventh house is where the sun sets. It's your union with another party in things like marriages or opponents or contracts. And then for example, like the ninth house is rising up to the 10th house. The 10th house being the highest, most public point is your career and publicity. Ninth house is rising up to the 10th, what supports career and publicity, your path of knowledge, your education, your long-term travel plans or origins. Fifth house follows the fourth house being the foundations of the chart. What is your foundation? Your family and your ancestry. Fifth house follows that. What follows that? Children. Like, these things come from their aspect to houses and how that is aspecting the ascendant. So you can learn more about house meanings in my house meanings video here, but in large part, the meanings for houses come from how those houses aspect the ascendant, because this vibrant hour marker, the ascendant, their aspect or lack of aspect, it determines what houses mean. So for example, the second house, sixth house, eighth house, and 12th house do not aspect the ascendant because they cannot be divided evenly into 360, therefore there's no relationship. So mostly sixth house, 12th house because of more complex aspectual considerations, but sixth house, 12th house are known as the most difficult houses in terms of house topics because they do not aspect the ascendant, and therefore they don't have a direct connection into empowering the vitality of the individual. The planetary joy scheme, which is a more advanced concept that Chris Brennan's done a great amount of work and pioneering on, further dives into house meanings, but it largely is like these whole sign aspects based on the 360-degree division and how that can be divided into equal parts. House meanings mean what they do because of their whole sign relationship to the ascendant. So to then contrast that, what are quadrant houses? Quadrant houses divide the chart into the ascendant-descendant axis, again from the MC to the IC, and they can either use time or space-based divisions to then divide those quadrants into 3 sections. So Placidus uses divisions by time, Porphyry takes the ascendant-descendant MC-IC, just cuts it up by 3. I'm not going to describe all the different kinds of house division here for quadrant houses. There's dozens, if not hundreds, but they create 4 quadrants and then they divide up those quadrants into 3. So where did quadrant houses first appear? This is where a lot of my research turns to the work of those like Robert Hand, Robert Schmidt, Robert Zoller, Chris Brennan and his work. Like the commentary that they provide has helped me navigate this because I was like searching for like where does quadrant houses show up, and they've done a lot of that translation work. Valens is also where I found the most helpful for this because Valens is like the easiest ancient author to read in my opinion and most personable. Like he looks like a cool guy. But Valens is pretty much always using whole sign houses, except, this is important, except and first when he starts using quadrant houses as an overlay for the length of life technique. So the length of life technique is first mentioned in like Nechepso and Pediciris, but I haven't really gotten it to work. Like I'm not really concerned with it. It's really hashed out in Valens, but like I've never gotten it to work reliably, maybe because we now don't die at indicators of physical detriment anymore. Like we have medicine and whatnot. But quadrant houses were not initially used as an alternative to whole sign houses. They were used as an overlay to look at timing indicators. So like you'd have whole sign houses and then overlay quadrant on top because the house degree cusps were used as sensitive timing points. So like if your ascendant is 15 Cancer, then like based on that, 15 degrees of some other house or whatever the quadrant house degree would be in another whole sign house would be a sensitive point. Technically first came equal houses where each house is still equal but it's off of the degree of the ascendant, which is another thing, but like equal houses are like whole sign houses but off of the degree of the ascendant rather than 0 degrees. But literally quadrant houses first originate out of the length of life technique as an overlay. So even in references to the beginnings of quadrant houses, whole sign houses are the basis. It's pretty well understood that whole sign houses are taken for granted for like what the houses or the places even are. Quadrant houses are like the decoration tablecloth on top of the table. The degrees of the quadrant houses are sensitive points. And because of the fact that like whole sign houses were so understood as the baseline, it's likely that was taken for granted when there was issues in the conflation or the reading of these texts later. Like they read these not understanding that whole sign houses might have been an overlay. And it's not like reading that as a mistake was wrong. Like mistakes can lead to breakthroughs. Mistakes can lead into valid techniques that arise as a mistake or a misreading. But based on the way that quadrant houses were first originated and then suddenly were adopted, as we'll get into, makes it seem like they were read out of context and therefore adopted and used like whole sign houses when that was not their original intention. Like ambiguity and confusion and seeing that in the text whole sign houses were like the basis, but it wasn't explained as that because it was taken for granted, led to in the Middle Ages and like what earlier, like these Arabic astrologers using quadrant houses. And after Abu Mashar displayed a preference for quadrant houses, that's when you really see the implementation pick up and like set a precedent. Or like after he did such his monumental work with quadrant houses, it was kind of like, now you see them really popping up. And many divergent quadrant house systems arose out of the ambiguous reading of what quadrant houses are. Like Regiomontanus was a favorite for a while due to William Lilly, and Placidus arose as the most popular during the 20th century because in large part those were the calculated tables available to us due to historical accident and what survived before the age of the internet and online ephemerae. So it's not as if Placidus was the more logical or best or more, like it's not like Placidus intentionally was like, this one makes the most sense, let's make this the most popular. It was literally like historical accident of availability of tables, and then now suddenly every website is Placidus. So quadrant houses are a whole thing. Placidus is one of dozens if not hundreds. It's not like whole sign versus Placidus, it's like whole sign versus quadrant, period. But I don't even see it as a versus because they're obviously two different categorical systems. There's no need for them to compete or reconcile. Like they were formed for different reasons, and I think that they're meant to perform different duties. So if you're reading a chart for house topics, like you are reading a chart and you want to read for someone's life, I recommend using whole sign houses. That is where the house topics originated from. Quadrant house cusps can be used as timing overlays for isolated techniques. And again, I don't see them as competing or which one is more accurate. I think that they're different uses. Like in India, they've been using whole sign houses for house topics plus the degrees of the Baba cusps for thousands of years without reason. They're not using quadrant houses for basic house readings or topics. Because the tenet of my philosophy always goes back to parsimony, which is the tenet that the simplest theory makes the most sense. Because like we have 12 signs, why not 12 houses to line up with the signs? No space-time weird shit, no hundreds of readings of how to divide that. Like quadrant houses, they aren't configured to the 12 zodiac signs, like they don't have a relation to those house meanings. And there's no interceptions, which again, that's not a reason for whole sign houses to be preferable, but like the parsimony of like not having interceptions is like. And if you cast someone's chart in like Alaska or Antarctica, it's fucking ridiculous. Like the chart falls apart if you cast a chart in Anchorage, Alaska. Like if it's not whole sign houses, the houses are fucking weird. Look up a chart in Anchorage, Alaska. It's fucking weird. And I don't think that insanity of a chart represents that everyone born in Anchorage is gonna have such insane life areas like that. You know what I mean? I think that's kind of weird. And I do not choose whole sign houses because it works best. Sure, I do find that house topics align much more coherently with whole sign houses, largely because they were originated out of that context. And I also don't use whole sign houses because it resonates most with me or like people I know. Like I don't care what you resonate with, what I resonate with, we can resonate with fucking anything. The Barnum effect is something we need to be wary of in astrology because we can spout random shit and people will believe it. And I say this a lot, but relativity is the killer of decent astrology. We have to be really intentional and precise. So I choose whole sign houses because of the basis for the rationale of the 12 houses, their meanings, and how the other house systems developed, not out of their correlation to those similar house meanings. With quadrant houses intended to be used as overlays, I find them more of use of that, and I don't really work with those overlays, so I don't feel the need to use them much in my practice. This is not saying that quadrant houses themselves are invalid, like no. This is saying that due to the rationale behind house systems, I find whole sign houses the most parsimonious choice, and I don't choose it based on accuracy, which I again think is a difficult, kind of flawed premise in astrology. There's rarely a way to measure accuracy sufficiently. I just go back to the philosophical rationale so that I can be like, there's no way for me to empirically necessarily verify this, but the principles of it make the most sense to me. And they're all mathematically accurate. It's about what the relevancy is to the house topics. So based on the historical argument, the logic lining up, and what I find to be the most sensible parsimonious argument, I use whole sign houses for my basic chart consultations looking at house topics. If you have any experience or point of view you with whole sign houses, using it, arguments for or against it, or quadrant houses, let me know down below. Let's discuss. And the bonus upside is that whole sign houses already has some of the upsides of quadrant houses built into it. Like there's a floating midheaven. The MC can fall anywhere in the top half of the chart, and whatever whole sign house the MC is in imports 10th house career significations into that area of life. So like my midheaven is in the 11th house, so the 11th house gets some 10th house career significations. And I think that adds some nuance and some of the quadrant house, particularities into whole sign houses off the get-go. And if you're reading the ancient text, you will notice that they call the 10th house the midheaven when we call the MC degree the midheaven, and quadrant houses prioritize this point for division rather than whole sign houses. And as a result, the IC, or the opposite point from the MC below the earth, can fall into any bottom whole sign house as well. So whole sign houses already incorporate some of this nuance of not necessarily just the 12-fold division without some variation into it, which is nice. So like, in summary, why make shit complicated? I like parsimony, I like understanding the rationale of why things started the way that they did, and whole sign houses is the OG queen. Like, so if you enjoyed this and you want to check out more of my informative videos, make sure that you do it down below. Otherwise, make sure you like, subscribe, leave your comments and thoughts. I don't think this is something to reconcile. This is something to understand when these house systems are most applicable and to talk about it. So discuss in comments below. Very, very open to like banter and debate and your thoughts. Take care, and I will see you in the next one.
Yeah. Yeah. You must be blinded by the lights. We came to shine here. Watch it look daytime in the night.